Ara, a uachtarán cuman na man múntóirí, a rúni na Áine dachis, a ghine úsla, a cholakia agus a chorde. Is mór an óir domsa a bheith an seo liveniuh chun labhart faoin na hathra atá bartathe don ardteist. Tá anna bheasagam ar múntóirí agus an da obair a bhíon ar siúil gach lá in our scolanna. Mar is óldíh bhí mé féin mar bhean múntóir ins na seachtaldaí agus cé go bhfuil a lán athrathe taga ar an saol ó hin, tá an táling sa tír seo nach bhfuil athru taga ar an ard bheas atá ag an bobbal ar múntóirí na hÉireann, agus ar an glú agus ar an gáil atá orthú thart faoin domhan. Minister, President of the ASTI, General Secretary of the Department of Education, fellow teachers, colleagues and friends. It's an honour and a privilege for me to be invited to speak at the opening of the 2025 ASTI Annual Convention here in Killarney. As I came into the conference centre, I was delighted to meet many of my former education students, not least your president, who, as he said, was one of my students, and indeed I remember well that he and a number of other teachers from the Kerry, Cork, Limerick border came from Ramore, and they'd collect each other and come over at 6 o'clock after school on a Wednesday evening and Saturdays, and we all had very interesting times. It was good times, but it's a great trip. It's quite typical. I mean, I think that a lot of this is forgotten. The introduction by your president, I didn't want to be boasting or anything, but I just wanted to make the point that I have been very deeply involved in education, and I particularly want to make that point in the context of senior cycle reform. I've also supported so much change in the Department of Education since I did my Leaving Cert 65 years ago. And I'm in awe of the commitment and dedication of teachers, not only to their students in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, in debates, sports, school plays, musicals, and projects such as SciFest and the Young Scientist, Junk Couture, and numerous other out-of-school initiatives. I sometimes feel, especially recently, that there is inadequate appreciation of teachers who, in their own time and with no additional remuneration, and I think that's important in the current context when we hear some, like those of us and the teachers, you who worked with me when I chaired the various committees and commissions and boards, we all did it voluntarily, no remuneration. And I'm horrified to hear the cost of some recent commissions of inquiry. It never cost, none of our education committees, boards, commissions, point system, whether it's special education, we never ever expected to be paid. But we all had to go back to work and do our own, make up our own teaching loads. So it's not as if, you know, you're not doing it. And this is particularly true in relation, I feel, to the current work of teachers on subject development groups. We are partners in education. The Minister has said that. We are allies, but we're not enemies, and I think this is very important in this debate. We are all trying to be very constructive, very helpful, very supportive, but perhaps we're not being listened to as much as we should be. I've one piece of advice. And why I mentioned all these is the one learning I took from all of those boards, commissions and so on, and the consultations which went with them. Consultation isn't new. There was consultation back in the 60s when free education was introduced. We went around the country to meet people, talking about what wasn't very popular, amalgamation of small primary schools, but also talking about making education available to the huge growth which occurred during the 70s as a result of the introduction of free second-level education. And I would say, listen to the teachers, as I said. It's the teachers who are at the chalk face. They know what will work and what won't work in the classroom and in the school. We can all produce great reports. I've written a lot of those reports myself, without any help from generative AI, I must say, or ChatGPT. But written reports are one thing, implementation is another. And when it comes to implementation, the devil is in the detail, and it's the teachers who are familiar with that detail. So in my longer script, I included an overview of 100 years of the Leaving Certificate, which of course we celebrated last year. But however, in the interest of brevity, I don't intend to go through that history today. Some of you in my classes on history of education will have heard me talking about these over the years. I'd just like to point out, and in fact it has been pointed out both by the Minister and by the President, the Leaving Cert has been with us for a long time. It's understood, it's trusted by the people of Ireland. Of course it has been revised and updated from time to time and will continue to require revision and updating. But we should be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Our education system, including the Leaving Cert, has served our young people and our country well. And I'm delighted that the Minister has mentioned this. It's also highlighted in the programme for government, which recognises the high quality of our education system and the extent to which our well-educated young people have contributed to Ireland's economic success. We can't afford to lose our reputation as a country which provides a well-educated young workforce. I'm actually repeating what the President of ASTI has said, but I didn't see his speech and he didn't see my speech. So, but again, to remind ourselves how much we have achieved. When I left school, fewer than 20% of my age group sat the Leaving Cert, and only 5% went on to university. I didn't go on initially to university, as many of us didn't. I went straight into the civil service. It was only after I got married, when there was a marriage bar, it was one of the positives of the marriage bar, that I went to college at night and did my degree, as many of you may have done as well. Most of my peers in primary school emigrated. They were unskilled and marginalised workers in the UK and the US, and sadly, they gave us not a very good reputation. They were often referred to as the lazy Irish. Thankfully, that description of our young graduates is never heard today. It's a very, very different world, and that is largely thanks to our teachers and our schools in what we have achieved. Now, in my overview of curriculum and syllabus reform, I'll start at the beginning of the millennium and just look briefly at junior cycle curriculum and the lessons we have learned. The most recent major reform of senior cycle and of Leaving Cert syllabi took place in the mid-1990s, about 1995 or thereabouts, when Leaving Certificate applied and LCVP were introduced, and most subject syllabi were updated and revised. Of course, many of them have been subsequently revised and revised again, but some of them are still sitting there in their mid-90s situation. The emphasis in the subsequent decades was on the reform of the primary curriculum and junior cycle curriculum, because obviously there was going to be a continuum of change. The new primary curriculum had been introduced in 1999, and the focus in the early 2000s was on the reform of junior cycle, a reform that we all initially welcomed. However, as you will remember, inexplicably, the design template, or the technical form of design as it's called by the NCCA for junior cycle subjects, was a template which was minimal and vague, and we were very concerned about it, consisting largely of a statement of learning outcomes, as famous learning outcomes for each subject. The template was justified on the basis that it reflected international best practice, but I undertook some research on behalf of some groups of teachers at the time, looked at a lot of different countries, because I've done a lot of international work as well. I didn't find one single country which had an externally assessed public education system using such a template. That's a very important distinction. If you're talking, as in some states of the United States, about school-based assessment, where there's huge variation from school to school, of course the assessment can be different and teachers can define their assessment in whatever way, but that is not what we have been doing in Ireland. Successive governments decided to keep publicly examined examinations at the end of junior cycle, and we still have that. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can have CBAs and all kinds of other different approaches, but I think we as teachers discussed, was there a sort of a hidden agenda that we weren't aware of? Otherwise, it was very hard to understand why that type of a template was used. I just go on there. Yes, that was the point I was making there. So again, we've talked about this, and it's very relevant to the Leaving Cert. The learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities, and the assessment should all happen at the same time. And this is what I was very interested to listen earlier on to the various motions and the discussions here in the convention. The concern that assessment is not happening at the same time as the specifications are being drawn up. In good curriculum design, good syllabus design, they should all happen at the same time. We have 3 different groups. We have NCCA, State Examinations Commission, and IDA. Interestingly enough, when I was on the first Curriculum and Examinations Board, when Gemma Hussey was Minister for Education back 40 years ago, the intention at that time of the Fine Gael government was to have a single body which would be responsible both, for 3 things: curriculum, examinations, and the related CPD for teachers and the provision of resources. That didn't happen for various reasons, and it did cause, to some extent, the disconnect that we saw in the early years of junior cycle, and indeed that to a small extent still exists today. And it didn't surprise me at all in the light of my 2014 report to see the survey carried out on behalf of ASTI in 2022, which said it would be an understatement to say that there is a profound and universal concern among teachers about the capacity of the junior cycle subject specifications to prepare students for senior cycle curriculum. Because in fact, learning outcomes are always written at a minimum, not at a maximum. And that seemed to have got lost along the way, and because there was no depth of treatment, and we heard the discussion of that this morning, teachers had no guidelines as to the depth of treatment, and the concern about falling standards was inevitable. In relation then to the revision of Leaving Cert, we raised this issue then again, and indeed the ASTI has been vocal about it, and other science, the ISTA and other subject associations made submissions to the Joint Oireachtas Committee. And 2 of the reports of the Joint Oireachtas Committee, one in 2022, one in 2023, said very clearly a key priority should be that the revised syllabus for each subject should be far more detailed. This is talking about the Leaving Cert, and comprehensive, with comprehensive instructions for teachers. And the committee recommended that the NCCA reviews the proposed design of the new specifications to ensure that teachers are properly supported and students are taught to the highest professional standards. That was just 2 years ago. Now, there has been some improvement. Now, I don't need to spend time on the initial proposals that the then Minister Norma Foley, set out in 2004 for senior cycle reform, other than to say that some of the proposals that were made in 2004, there was an NCCA report in 2004 on a very significant senior cycle reform, but the then Minister for Education, Mary Hanifin, as you will remember, did not accept it, and she described it as a Rolls-Royce model of curriculum reform. But some aspects of the proposals went ahead. So during the last 20 years, Leaving Cert subjects such as politics and society, design and communication graphics, physical education were introduced, as well as many other languages. Some existing subject syllabi were revised, and we heard about them this morning, Ag Science, for example, and additional assessment components, usually worth 20% of the overall marks, were incorporated. And it is of interest to be aware that only 14 of the current 43 Leaving Certificate subjects are examined entirely by an end-of-year examination. All the others, almost 30 of them, have some either an oral or is music, practical, and construction studies, all of those areas. So there are, but it's usually 20%. The Equity and Excellence for All, then, the reimagined senior cycle, was announced in March 2022. And under these proposals, you remember that it was proposed that paper 1 in both Irish and English would be examined at the end of 5th year, but without a revision of the subject specification, which obviously wasn't feasible. And new Leaving Cert subjects, drama, film and theatre studies, and climate action and sustainable development, as well as revised curricula in biology, chemistry, physics and business, would be introduced in network schools and would be rolled out in all schools later on. 60% of the total marks, it was announced, would be awarded for the written examination paper, with 40% awarded to the AAC, the another addition assessment component. It was envisaged that the rollout, and this is important, would be gradual, and that the new syllabi would be piloted the new and revised syllabi would be piloted in network schools. And you remember back at that time, that's what we were all expecting. However, in September 2023, the Minister rode back on some aspects of equity and excellence, and revised proposals were issued in that month. The proposal for students to sit paper 1 in English and Irish had been dropped, but the pace of change would be accelerated, and the gradual or piloted introduction of new and revised subjects was removed. No fewer than 9 new and revised Leaving Cert subjects would be introduced in September 2025, where we're coming up to it now, and would be examined for the first time in 2027. And each of these would, of course, have the 40% for the AACs. Draft specifications for the new and revised subjects were circulated by the NCCA in December 2023, and you'll remember that feedback was requested in a very short space of time. 6 weeks we were given, 7 weeks, that's right, but that included the Christmas holidays. The design improvement template was somewhat of an improvement on the junior cycle design, but it was still not perfect. However, there was a little bit of flexibility in some of the subjects, the subject development groups. Some of those 9 revised and new subjects are more comprehensive than others. As somebody said to me, have you no life? I read all 9 of them when they came out, and I sent in submissions, constructive comments on 3 or 4 of them. However, I was very disappointed that not just mine, but everybody, all of you and all the subject associations who sent in those responses, they were never shared with the subject development groups. And they... It's something I just simply cannot understand. If I go back, as I say, to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, before the computers, when we got submissions, for example, for the Points Commission in the 90s, for the Special Education Review Group, every single one of those written submissions were photocopied it was in the department at the time, and every member of the board or the council or the committee got copies. And of course, today it is so easy to do. I mean, for example, if you look at the Joint Oireachtas Committee, every single one of the submissions that were made are just, they're 300 pages, but it's only from the point of view, I've spoken to the clerk who does the work in there, and she said, well, it's no problem. They all come in online anyway. We just put them all together and we put them in as an appendix. Similarly, the Citizens' Assembly does the same thing. So I would appeal to the Minister, not just in relation to the subject development groups, if she has any say in that, but also in the National Convention. When I was at, the Secretary General was at a meeting I was at last Wednesday when we were revisiting the National Convention of 1993. I have kept an archive of all the papers of that time. I think I'm the only one who keeps these archives. But again, there was no problem. We got copies. Now, that was pre-computer days as well. So I would ask that genuinely sharing, if we are partners in education, and that was a phrase first used by Gemma Hussey, who sadly died recently, but if we are partners in education, we deserve to hear what our other partners have to say. The proposal that in each subject 40% of marks would be allocated to an AAC caused and continues to cause concern among some students. The students' union, it depends on the year. Some of them are in favour, some of them are not. Teachers, unanimously, university representatives, and some members of the general public are concerned. And this is particularly the case regarding biology, chemistry, and physics, where issues such as health and safety, inadequacy of laboratory facilities, equipment and resources have been highlighted. And again, in this regard, the teacher and university representatives on those 3 subject development groups expressed concern and disassociated themselves with the AACs, but this was not recorded. And we heard earlier today, and I have heard it as well, that there was a consensus. There wasn't a consensus on those committees. And in fact, the State Examinations Commission itself in 2017, some of you may be aware of this, they carried out a pilot survey, a pilot study on practical assessment. Now, at the time, they were looking at whether it could be assessed through genuine people going down, examiners seeing the students working. But the issues that came up were similar to the issues. They were concerned about the individual student having to undertake an investigative project, each individual student. And they wrote at that time in that report, it would not be safe to assume that laboratory facilities and equipment in schools are currently of a sufficient standard to support a rollout of this model of practical assessment without further investment, the scale of which has yet to be determined. So that's the State Examinations Commission themselves. They have expressed concern about the situation, and some of the proposals that they have produced in the guidelines that went out earlier this year to schools contradict some of these comments that they made. The proposed investigative projects in biology, chemistry, and physics will not now be directly assessed in the lab by external examiners, but an experiment will still have to be carried out by each individual student. They'll then be required to write up a detailed report on the experiment and submit it to the SEC. As well as having concerns about the feasibility of 24 students in a class with 1 science teacher, and I think, with 1 science teacher and no laboratory technician, by the way. Most of our schools don't have laboratory technicians, which is very unusual by international standards. I have written here, I would question whether a written narrative report is a valid way of assessing a practical experiment or investigative project. It's not. And that point was made in the debates this morning. You had a much better word for it than I'm using today, but I'm using the old words we used to talk about, validity and reliability of examinations, but it's not a valid form. You know, you wouldn't, well, we used to, before 1959, assess oral Irish by a written paper, but that doesn't make any sense. You can't, but that's what used to happen. And the oral Irish was introduced in 1960. So, and if a learning outcome requires some practical work, you have to see the practical work being done. I mean, you don't, anyway. And I have just here, I don't know if I can get it. Yes, I can. The hypothetical student who has to take, who says she's doing 8 subjects, Irish, English, Maths, French, Biology, Chemistry, Business and Geography. At Easter, this time, 2 years' time, she will have 2 oral exams. She'll have to submit 4 AACs, 1 in biology, 1 in chemistry, 1 in business and 1 in geography. And she'll still have to prepare for written exam papers in all of her 8 subjects. I just say, how can this be deemed to reduce student stress? And also for the school management and the school principal, it's a big issue. And you all know that there are principals who have actually handed in their resignation on the basis that they're having people who are coming closer, who might have stayed another few years. But the challenge of ensuring that all this resources are in place, and the computers, the requirement of the computers. We've heard some of the experiences of, say, the ag science people in terms of making sure you have access to the proper software, the proper hardware, and that you have internet access for all of those 168 or 200 or 300 students all at the same time. It's a big challenge. And in fairness, I can't even imagine the logistic challenge that this will set for the State Examinations Commission, which I hugely admire the work they do. They'll eventually have to grapple with a huge amount of materials going into the exams. My own concern, having chaired the Education Disadvantage Committee and having a very real commitment, as the Minister has, to students coming from an educationally disadvantaged background, I believe that 40% of marks for AACs are likely to widen the gap between those from educationally disadvantaged backgrounds. I am aware, of course, that the current Leaving Cert doesn't provide a level playing field for all students. We know that those who have can buy grinds, can buy help, and so on. But the introduction of 40% will widen that gap, in my view. The latter, I mean, yeah. Their more advantaged students will have access to additional support from outside the classroom, from parents and relatives, from paid tutors, from access to resources and facilities which will not be available for the less advantaged. And regardless of how carefully a student's work outside a supervised examination hall is monitored, students with access to such additional support and resources will be at a considerable advantage when preparing their AACs. There's no doubt about that. You're all aware of that. And then, of course, we've heard a couple of times today about the concern about generative artificial intelligence, generative AI. The concern is exacerbated by the availability and rapid development of generative AI tools, whereas less than 2 years ago, when the state SEC guidelines were issued and when I first accessed the free version of ChatGPT, it was almost the only accessible AI tool. But we now have a range of AI tools: DeepSeek, Microsoft Copilot. There are built-in AI tools in Adobe, in WhatsApp, and Google, for example. Somebody mentioned Google this morning having, to their surprise, being able to give them a full reply. That's because there's an AI element within Google now. It's widely, there's a lot of literature, and many of you have read it, on how can we have software to distinguish between text written by generative AI and text written by a human. And the conclusion for the moment is no, there's no way that you can do that. There is no software that will do that at the moment. And we've heard a number, the various teacher associations have had some very good speakers in recent months talking about that. Exam boards in other countries, this was touched on this morning, and I've kept in touch with some of them, some of the larger ones, in the UK, in International Baccalaureate, the French BAC, and so on. And higher education institutions in this country have already adjusted their modes of assessment in the light of the availability of generative AI. Because of the difficulty or the impossibility of ensuring that work submitted by a student has not been undertaken, either in whole or in part by generative AI, the marks allocated for essays or projects undertaken outside a supervised examination hall are either reduced or disregarded in final results. Some of the exam boards in the UK, for example, they no longer include in the science areas the marks, the practical marks, in the result, in the award and in the grade. They show it separately as a pass-fail, but the actual grade and the award is based only on the written supervised examination. That's something worth thinking about. A committee set up by the Irish government to report recently on the implications of AI has not yet come up with any solutions. That committee, which many of you are familiar with, just within the last 2 weeks recommended that it unfortunately didn't have any teachers on it, but it said that government should facilitate a national conversation between teachers and their unions and representative organisations, parents, guardians and their representative organisations, policymakers, technology companies, students and their representative organisations, and educational technology innovators. That's a quotation. And so we look forward to this discussion and a debate in the very near future, because hopefully they may be able to come up with some advice to various government departments about the implications of AI, but particularly in the education area. Let me now talk about the authentication of student AACs. For me, having spent so much time in the higher education sector, I, of course, have long since come to the conclusion that it's not realistic or fair to ask teachers to authenticate the work of students which is not carried out in an examination hall, and particularly now, it's not possible. And you are aware of your own, the Red Sea poll that was taken on behalf of ASTI, that almost 90% of teachers who took part said that the new Leaving Cert AACs will create difficulties when it comes to authenticating students' work. For me, I fail to see why Leaving Cert students cannot be trusted to authenticate their own AACs. This is normal practice in further and higher education. Part of a student's education in senior cycle, and we've heard some of you teachers who are introducing students to AI and other tools, they include in their education a module on ethical education and the ethical use and the moral use of such tools, with an emphasis on the total unacceptability of plagiarism or cheating in any form, and an explanation to students as to how unacceptable that is, and that, of course, it's cheating, and there's no doubt about that. All of our Leaving Cert students are over 16 years of age, and many are over 18 years of age. In other words, they're adults. A 16-year-old, I looked this up to see what is a 16-year-old. Yes, I just have a quote. That's the kind of a phrase that we would use in the university or higher education sector. I hereby declare that this portfolio or project or whatever is my own original work. Where other sources of information have been used, these are acknowledged appropriately. Very straightforward, very simple. But that's been long-standing in the higher education sector. But this is what a 16-year-old is legally permitted to do, much more than I actually thought. They're permitted to drink wine, beer, or cider with a meal in a restaurant. They legally can have consensual sex. They can get married with their parents' permission. They can get a license to drive a moped. They can claim social welfare benefits in some circumstances. And they can open a bank account or get a full-time job. So surely if they're allowed to do all these things, they should be trusted to authenticate their own AACs. So, an alternative, of course, might be to ask their parents or guardians to authenticate their work. That's also a possibility. So what should be done? I mean, I'm skipping over some of this. The importance of collaboration between the NCCA, IDA and SEC, hugely important. We really don't want this time, I know you have already been aware of this, like during junior cycle CPD, you as teachers were all asked to unpack the learning outcomes yourself. That is not an acceptable, we would never do that. I mean, you shouldn't do that in a public examination system. So the IDA needs to have the answers. I mean, there's no point in going out and you ask questions and say, well, we don't have the answers to that. They need to know, we need to get that together. Again, I have to praise SEC. I think the SEC is doing its more than its best. They have issued sample examination papers. They have asked for feedback currently, as you know, from teachers on those, and hopefully they will listen to that feedback. And there, of course, will be problems because they weren't really involved when the learning outcomes were the specifications were being developed to the extent that they should have been. I mean, whenever I work with students with universities, and I've been doing a lot of that work across Europe since I retired, we would always expect that at the same time, if you have a learning outcome, your first question is, how do I assess it? And there's a backwash effect. Again, some people don't like that, but that is a reality. It has always been a reality. The examinations will, to a significant extent, determine what is learned by students. They'll ask you, is that relevant for the examination? And that happens all the time. So my suggestion, and I had no idea what was coming up here today. I have not been in touch with your president or with the General Secretary or anybody else. I'm arm's length removed from the ASTI. But I have concluded that the introduction of 40% of marks for AACs for subjects where teachers have identified AACs as problematic should be postponed. Now, sorry. Wait till I finish. I would add to that, this doesn't mean that the updated subject specifications should necessarily be delayed. Everybody is in agreement that updating of specifications is required, but that can happen with an exam without the AACs for the moment in most subjects. It may be different, perhaps in one of the new subjects I was reading in detail, the very detailed drama, film and theatre studies. Perhaps in those cases, to use the Irish phrase, some of the assessment is fit to foot in the specification. So, and they might be quite happy, the teachers in those areas, although I'm not sure we will have very many schools taking up those subjects because they're very demanding in terms of resources. But if teachers are happy to go ahead with some of them, that could happen. But in general, and particularly in the science subjects, where they're really, as I say, the assessment, you could implement the full specifications without the assessment if you had, as we have had in the past, mandatory experiments as part of the programme. Again, you science teachers are familiar with that. I'd also suggest, it's just a thought, it's also just an idea in terms of the SEC, because I've had 2 of my grandsons doing the Leaving Cert last year and the year before. I know that the students they can get full access to the breakdown of their marks. Some of you know that. I was really very impressed by that. There's no big deal for the SEC. They already make them available on request to the students. So if we had as a general rule that, for example, it would look a bit like this, that the individual Leaving Certificate results would show separately on the results as they come out to the school, the grade for the AAC, the grade for the exam, and the composite grade. It will provide useful information for employers and for further and higher education institutions in assessing students' suitability for various courses. Some of them may genuinely be much better at the AACs than they are at the exam, but it could also provide, where there's a major discrepancy between the grade in the written examination and the grade in the AAC, some further analysis might be carried out. And that's a simple thing to do. I don't think the SEC would have a difficulty with that, but the school, the parents, everybody would have access to not just the final grade. And I mean, it's not at all impossible that if higher education institutions have doubts about the validity of the AAC, they can do their choosing simply on the written examination, as happens in some of the English universities. And finally, students, in my view, should not be asked to authenticate, teachers should not be asked to authenticate students' AACs. I just can't see that this is possible, and I can't say. And so